They thought my mind was gone. They thought I'd forgotten how to write checks, how to make phone calls, how to remember where I kept my will. What they didn't know was that I'd been watching them plot my disappearance for months, and while they were busy dividing up my fortune, I was busy making sure they'd never see a penny of it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning they came to take me away, I was sitting in my garden, watching the hummingbirds fight over the feeder I'd filled just an hour before. The irony wasn't lost on me that creatures with brains the size of pearls had more loyalty than my own children. I heard the van pull into my circular driveway, heard the crunch of expensive shoes on gravel, and I knew without looking that this was the day they'd been planning since Christmas. My name is Jacqueline Nelson, though everyone who's ever mattered has called me Jackie. And at 78 years old, I've learned that the sharpest knife in any family's drawer isn't the one in the kitchen. It's the one they slide between your ribs when they think you're not paying attention. What my 3 children and their spouses didn't realize was that I'd been paying very close attention indeed. The Nelson family fortune started with my late husband Richard's grandfather, who had the good sense to buy land in what would become downtown Seattle back when it was still considered the edge of nowhere. 3 generations of careful investments, strategic partnerships, and an almost supernatural ability to spot opportunity had built our wealth into something most people only see in movies. $50 million, give or take a few million depending on the market, all sitting in trusts and accounts that I'd been managing since Richard passed 5 years ago. Richard used to joke that I had a mind like a steel trap and twice the business sense of any of his Harvard-educated colleagues. He wasn't wrong. While he was the face of Nelson Enterprises, I was the one who read every contract, questioned every deal, and caught the mistakes that would have cost us millions. When he died of a massive heart attack at the country club, I didn't just inherit his money. I inherited the responsibility of protecting it. That responsibility included protecting it from our children. Marcus, the eldest at 52, who'd managed to burn through 2 trust funds already with his series of failed restaurant ventures and cocaine habits he thought I didn't know about. Veronica, 49, whose husband Brad had been embezzling from his law firm for 3 years running. And Christopher, my youngest at 45, who'd never held a job longer than 18 months and had somehow convinced himself that his gambling debts were just temporary setbacks. I'd been watching them circle like vultures for years, but the plotting had intensified dramatically after I'd refused to advance Christopher another $100,000 for what he called an investment opportunity in cryptocurrency. That was 6 months ago. Since then, they'd started having family meetings without me, whispering conversations that stopped when I entered rooms, and suddenly showing unprecedented interest in my daily routines and mental state. The first red flag came when Marcus suggested I might want to consider hiring a companion to help around the house. I'd been living independently in the same 4,000-square-foot home for 30 years, managing my own finances, cooking my own meals, and maintaining a social calendar that would exhaust people half my age. But suddenly, according to my son, I was displaying signs of confusion and forgetfulness that concerned him. The second red flag was Veronica's newfound interest in my medical appointments. She started insisting on driving me to my routine checkups, sitting in on consultations with my doctor, and asking pointed questions about cognitive testing and mental acuity evaluations. She'd studied psychology in college for exactly 1 semester before switching to communications, but now she was suddenly an expert on age-related mental decline. The third and final red flag was Christopher's surprise visit 3 weeks ago, accompanied by a woman he introduced as his friend Sarah, who happened to be a geriatric care specialist. They'd sat in my living room, drinking my coffee and eating my homemade scones, while Sarah asked subtle questions about my daily routines, my memory, and my ability to handle complex tasks. I played along, even pretending to struggle with a few simple questions, while mentally cataloging every word of their rehearsed performance. That night, I'd called my private investigator. Elena Rodriguez had been working for me for 15 years, initially hired to conduct background checks on potential business partners and employees. She was discreet, thorough, and had a talent for uncovering information that people preferred to keep buried. When I told her I suspected my children were planning something involving my mental competency, she didn't seem surprised. Within 2 weeks, Elena had uncovered the entire conspiracy. Marcus had been meeting with an elder law attorney named Harrison Wells, discussing guardianship procedures and the process for having someone declared mentally incompetent. Veronica had been researching memory care facilities, specifically looking for places that limited family visits and outside contact. Christopher had been in touch with financial advisors about managing large inheritances and the tax implications of sudden wealth acquisition. But the most damning evidence was a recorded phone conversation Elena had obtained through methods I didn't ask about, and she didn't volunteer to explain. It was Christopher talking to someone named Kevin, presumably his bookie, promising that he'd have quote 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 quote. The plan, as Elena pieced it together, was elegantly simple. They would gather evidence of my supposed mental decline, petition the court for guardianship, have me committed to a memory care facility, and then gain control of my finances as my legal guardians. Once I was safely tucked away and declared incompetent, they could access my accounts, liquidate my investments, and divide the fortune among themselves. The beauty of it, from their perspective, was that even if I protested, who would believe the word of a woman diagnosed with dementia? They'd underestimated two crucial factors. First, that I was perfectly lucid and had been for every day of my 78 years. And second, that I was Richard Nelson's wife, which meant I didn't just have money. I had the connections, resources, and ruthless pragmatism to destroy anyone who threatened what was mine. The morning of their intervention, I was ready. I'd spent the previous 3 weeks carefully documenting my mental acuity. I'd taken comprehensive cognitive tests administered by an independent neurologist, Dr. Amanda Foster, who confirmed that my mental faculties were not only intact, but sharper than most people 30 years younger. I'd had my longtime attorney, Robert Chen, prepare new documentation regarding my estate planning and mental competency. Most importantly, I'd made some significant changes to my will that my children were going to find very educational. But first, I had to endure their performance. Marcus arrived first, as he always did when there was unpleasant business to handle. He'd inherited Richard's height and strong jaw, but none of his integrity or intelligence. He parked his BMW next to my rose garden and walked up the flagstone path with the measured gait of someone steeling himself for an unpleasant conversation. "Morning, Mother," he said, kissing my cheek with the mechanical affection he'd perfected over the years. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" I continued deadheading my roses, not bothering to look up. "It wasn't till about 5 minutes ago." He laughed uncomfortably, the way he always did when he couldn't tell if I was joking or insulting him. "Well, Veronica and Chris should be here Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Minute. We wanted to talk to you about something important. I imagine you do. Veronica arrived exactly 3 minutes later, her silver Lexus crunching to a stop behind Marcus's car. She emerged wearing what I'd come to think of as her concerned daughter outfit. A conservative navy blazer, pearls that had belonged to Richard's mother, and an expression of such practiced worry that she could have won awards for it. Brad wasn't with her, which didn't surprise me. Her husband had the backbone of a chocolate eclair and avoided family confrontations whenever possible. Christopher was last, as usual. His red Tesla made enough noise to wake the dead, which I suspected was intentional. He wanted to make sure I heard him coming, probably hoping to catch me off guard or flustered. Instead, I simply glanced at my watch and noted that he was 7 minutes late, which was actually early for Christopher. "Hi, Mom," he said, bounding up the path with false energy. "Sorry, I'm running behind. Traffic was murder coming from the city." Christopher had never been a good liar, even as a child. Traffic wasn't murder at 10:30 on a Tuesday morning, and his condo was exactly 12 minutes from my house via the most direct route. I'd driven it myself many times. They gathered around me in the garden like mourners at a funeral, which in many ways they were. They thought they were here to bury my independence, my autonomy, and my control over my own life. What they didn't realize was that they were actually here for their own funeral, at least as far as my inheritance was concerned. "Mom," Marcus began, using the voice he reserved for board meetings and other occasions when he needed to sound authoritative, We've been talking, and we're worried about you. I set down my gardening shears and looked at him directly. Worried about what, specifically? Veronica stepped forward, her face a masterpiece of manufactured concern. You've been seeming a little confused lately, forgetting things, repeating yourself, having trouble with simple tasks. Such as? Christopher cleared his throat. Well, last week when I called, you couldn't remember what you'd had for breakfast that morning. This was true. I told him I couldn't remember what I'd eaten for breakfast because I'd been distracted by watching him through my kitchen window as he rifled through my mailbox looking for financial statements. It had seemed more expedient than calling the police. And when I took you to Dr. Peterson last month, Veronica added, you seemed confused about your medications. Also true. I'd pretended to be confused about my medications because I'd wanted to see how far she'd push the narrative of my supposed mental decline. The answer, apparently, was quite far. Marcus pulled a folded brochure from his jacket pocket. We found a wonderful place called Sunset Manor. It's a memory care facility with an excellent reputation. The staff is highly trained, the amenities are first-rate, and they specialize in providing a safe, structured environment for people who are experiencing cognitive challenges. I took the brochure and examined it carefully. Sunset Manor looked like a cross between a luxury hotel and a minimum security prison, which I supposed was exactly what it was. The marketing materials emphasize security, medical supervision, and limited outside contact to reduce confusion and agitation in residents. And you think I belong in a place like this? We think you deserve the best possible care, Veronica said, reaching out to squeeze my hand with tears actually forming in her eyes. She'd always been the best actor of the three. We've already spoken with the administrators, Christopher added. They have an opening, and they're willing to fast-track the admission process given your situation. My situation? Your declining mental state, Mother, Marcus said with exaggerated patience. We can't stand by and watch you deteriorate when there are professionals who can help you. I folded the brochure neatly and slipped it into my gardening apron. How thoughtful of you all to arrange this without consulting me. We didn't want to upset you unnecessarily, Veronica explained. Sometimes these transitions are easier when the family handles the logistics. I see. And what exactly would happen to my finances while I'm receiving this excellent care? The three of them exchanged glances so quickly that if I hadn't been watching for it, I might have missed it entirely. Well, Marcus said carefully, someone would need to manage your affairs. Make sure your bills are paid, your investments are handled properly, that sort of thing. Someone meaning you? Meaning us, Veronica corrected. We'd share the responsibility. Make sure everything is handled the way you'd want it to be. The way I'd want it to be. Exactly, Christopher said, his voice bright with relief that I seemed to be understanding. We know how important your financial security is to you, Mom. We'd never do anything that wasn't in your best interest. I stood up slowly, brushing dirt from my gardening gloves, and looked at each of my children in turn. Marcus, who'd spent his entire adult life expecting his inheritance to bail him out of his poor decisions. Veronica, who'd married a man whose ethical flexibility had finally caught up with him and was now looking for a financial life raft. Christopher, who'd gambled away every opportunity I'd ever given him and was now gambling with my freedom. When would this transition take place? Today, Marcus said, and for the first time his voice carried a hint of the steel that had made his father successful. We have a van waiting at the end of the driveway. We've already packed some of your things, just the essentials, and arranged for the rest to be brought later. You've packed my things, just some clothes and personal items, Veronica assured me. We didn't want you to have to deal with the stress of packing. I walked over to the stone bench where I'd been sitting and picked up my phone. That's very considerate. I suppose I should make a few phone calls before we go. Let my attorney know about the change in my living situation. Contact my financial advisor, that sort of thing. Actually, Christopher said quickly, the staff at Sunset Manor handles all of that. They have people who specialize in helping residents with those kinds of transitions. It's better if you don't worry about it right now. Better for whom? For you, Mom, Marcus said, his patience clearly wearing thin. Look, this is hard for all of us, but it's the right thing to do. You're not thinking clearly, and that's not your fault. But it means you can't make these kinds of decisions anymore. I looked down at my phone, scrolled through my contacts, and found the number I was looking for. Before we go anywhere, I'd like to call Dr. Foster. She's the neurologist who evaluated me last week. I think you should hear what she has to say about my mental state. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the hummingbirds chattering at their feeder. You saw a neurologist? Veronica asked faintly. Last Tuesday. Dr. Amanda Foster at Seattle Presbyterian. Comprehensive cognitive evaluation, memory tests, the works. She said I have the mental acuity of someone 20 years younger. I smiled at them pleasantly. Would you like me to call her, or would you prefer to speak with my attorney first? Marcus's face had gone the color of old concrete. What attorney? Robert Chen. He's been handling my legal affairs since before you were born, Marcus. Lovely man. Very thorough. He was quite interested when I told him about your plans for my future. Christopher's hands were shaking as he pulled out his own phone. Look, Mom, maybe we should slow down here. Maybe we jumped the gun a little. Oh, I don't think you jumped the gun at all. I think you planned this very carefully. The fake concern about my mental state, the convenient memory care facility with an opening, the financial guardianship arrangements, it's really quite impressive how thoroughly you thought it through. Veronica was crying now, but these weren't the practiced tears she'd been deploying for months. These were the real thing, born of fear and the dawning realization that their carefully constructed plan was falling apart. The thing is, I continued, settling back onto my bench and crossing my legs, I've been planning too, and I've had a lot longer to think about it. What do you mean? Marcus asked, though I could tell from his voice that he already knew he didn't want to hear the answer. I pulled the brochure for Sunset Manor from my apron and held it up. This place looks lovely. Truly. I'm sure the residents who actually need memory care are very happy there. But I won't be joining them, because there's nothing wrong with my memory. In fact, my memory is excellent. I remember every conversation we've had about my supposed mental decline. I remember every lie you've told me about your concern for my well-being. I remember every meeting you've had with lawyers and financial advisors to discuss managing my estate. The van at the end of my driveway started its engine, and I could see the driver looking toward us uncertainly. Most importantly, I said, standing up and walking toward the house, I remember exactly where I keep my will, and I remember making some significant changes to it 3 weeks ago. Changes that I think you're going to find very educational. I paused at the back door and turned to look at my children one more time. They were standing frozen in my garden like some twisted tableau of family dysfunction, their faces reflecting the slow dawning horror of people who'd just realized they'd been outmaneuvered by someone they'd underestimated. The van can go, I told them. I won't be needing it today, or any day for that matter, but I suggest you all come inside. We have some things to discuss, and I think you're going to want to sit down for this conversation. I walked into my house, leaving the door open behind me, and headed for the safe where I kept my most important documents. It was time for my children to learn what happened when you tried to bury someone who was still very much alive, and who remembered exactly how to fight back. They followed me into the house like condemned prisoners walking to their execution, which in a way they were. The clicking of Veronica's heels on my marble foyer echoed like gunshots, and Christopher's breathing had become so labored, I wondered if he might actually hyperventilate right there in my hallway. Marcus brought up the rear, his face set in the grim expression he'd worn as a child when he'd been caught stealing from his siblings' piggy banks. I led them into my study, the same room where Richard had conducted business for 30 years, and where I'd continued managing our affairs since his death. The walls were lined with first edition books, awards from various charitable organizations, and photographs of Richard and me, with senators, governors, and business leaders, whose names regularly appeared in Forbes. It was a room designed to remind visitors that they were in the presence of serious money and serious power. My safe was built into the wall behind a painting of Mount Rainier that Richard had commissioned from a local artist in 1987. The painting was beautiful, but more importantly, it concealed a Mosler double-guard safe that could withstand everything short of a nuclear blast. I'd had the combination changed after Richard's funeral, and I was the only person who knew the new numbers. Sit down, I told my children, gesturing toward the leather chairs arranged in front of my desk. They hesitated, probably wondering if this was some kind of trap, which of course it was. Everything that had happened in the last 6 months had been a trap, carefully constructed and patiently executed. I opened the safe and withdrew a manila folder thick enough to choke a horse. Inside were documents that would forever change the relationship between me and my children, assuming we had any relationship left when this conversation was over. I placed the folder on my desk and sat down in Richard's old chair, the one I'd reupholstered in burgundy leather the year after he died. Before we discuss your touching concern for my mental health, I began, opening the folder and removing the first document. I thought you might be interested in some information I've gathered over the past few weeks. I slid a photograph across the desk toward Marcus. It showed him sitting in a downtown coffee shop with Harrison Wells, the elder law attorney Elena had identified. The timestamp indicated it was taken exactly 11 days ago. Marcus picked up the photograph with hands that weren't quite steady. This doesn't mean anything. I was just getting some legal advice about estate planning. Estate planning for whom? I asked pleasantly. Your estate consists of a BMW with 18 months of payments remaining, a condo with negative equity, and credit card debt that exceeds most people's annual salaries. I removed a second photograph and slid it toward Veronica. This one showed her standing outside Sunset Manor, talking animatedly with a woman in scrubs. This was taken last Thursday, around 2 in the afternoon. According to the facility's records, you toured their memory care unit and specifically asked about their policy regarding family visits and resident communication with the outside world. Veronica's carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the fact that she'd gone completely pale. I was just researching options. It's not a crime to want the best care for your mother. No, it's not a crime, I agreed. But conspiracy to defraud an elderly person of their assets certainly is. As is filing false documentation with the court system to obtain guardianship under fraudulent pretenses. I turned to Christopher and removed a third item from the folder. This wasn't a photograph but a printed transcript of a phone conversation. This is particularly interesting, Christopher. Would you like to read it, or shall I read it aloud for everyone? Christopher's Adam's apple bobbed like a fishing lure. I don't know what that is. It's a transcript of a phone conversation you had with someone named Kevin Torino on March 15th at approximately 7:30 in the evening. Mr. Torino is, according to my investigators' research, a bookmaker who operates out of a sports bar in Pioneer Square. You owe him quite a substantial sum of money. I put on my reading glasses and began to read from the transcript. Quote, I'm telling you, Kev, I'll have the money by the end of the month. My mom's finally losing it, and we're getting her committed next week. Once I have access to her accounts, I can pay you back with interest. We're talking about millions here, man. Enough to cover my debt 10 times over. End quote. The silence in the room was so profound I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Christopher looked like he might vomit, which would have been unfortunate for my Persian rug but somehow appropriate for the conversation. The interesting thing about that phone call, I continued, is that it establishes premeditation. You weren't concerned about my mental health, Christopher. You were concerned about your gambling debts, and you saw my supposed incompetency as a solution to your financial problems. I removed another document from the folder, this one bearing the letterhead of Harrison Wells's law firm. This is a draft petition for guardianship that Mr. Wells prepared at Marcus's request. It alleges that I suffer from progressive dementia, that I'm unable to manage my financial affairs, and that I pose a danger to myself if left unsupervised. The petition requests that guardianship be granted to my 3 children jointly, with full authority over my person and my estate. Marcus cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of composure. Look, Mother, I think there's been a misunderstanding here. Oh, I don't think there's been any misunderstanding at all. I think I understand the situation perfectly. You conspired to have me declared mentally incompetent, so you could gain control of my money. You researched memory care facilities where you could warehouse me while you liquidated my assets. You even had the legal paperwork prepared before you bothered to have me evaluated by a single medical professional. I stood up and walked to the window that overlooked my garden. The hummingbirds were still fighting over the feeder, tiny warriors defending their territory with a ferocity that put my children's plotting to shame. The problem with your plan, I said without turning around, is that it was based on a fundamental misconception. You assumed I was a helpless old woman who could be easily manipulated and discarded. You forgot that I'm the same woman who helped your father build a $50 million empire from a $10,000 inheritance and a willingness to work 18-hour days. I turned back to face them, and for the first time since this conversation began, I allowed my anger to show in my voice. You forgot that I've been handling complex financial transactions since before you were born. You forgot that I have relationships with attorneys, accountants, private investigators, and business leaders that span 4 decades. Most importantly, you forgot that I raised you, which means I know exactly how your minds work and exactly what you're capable of when you think no one is watching. Veronica was crying again, but these weren't tears of manipulation. These were tears of genuine fear. Mom, please, we never meant for things to go this far. We were just worried about you, and maybe we handled it wrong, but we can fix this. Fix this? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Veronica, you researched memory care facilities with the thoroughness of someone planning a vacation. You asked about policies that would limit my contact with the outside world. You wanted to make sure that once I was committed, I wouldn't be able to reach anyone who might help me or question my supposed incompetency. I removed another document from the folder and placed it on the desk where all 3 of them could see it. This is a financial analysis prepared by Christopher's preferred money management firm. It outlines how my assets could be liquidated most efficiently, with particular attention to minimizing tax liability and maximizing immediate cash flow. The analysis assumes full access to my accounts within 60 days. Christopher's face had gone from pale to green. How did you get that? I told you, Christopher. I know people. I have resources. And when someone threatens to steal $50 million from me, I use every resource at my disposal to protect myself. I sat back down and removed the final document from the folder. This one was thicker than the others, bound in blue legal backing, and stamped with the seal of my attorney's office. This, I said, placing my hands flat on the document, is my new will. I had it prepared 3 weeks ago, immediately after I confirmed the extent of your conspiracy. It's been properly witnessed, notarized, and filed with my attorney's office. The 3 of them stared at the document like it was a coiled rattlesnake. Would you like to know what it says? Marcus found his voice first, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. What does it say? I opened the will to a page I'd marked with a yellow sticky note. It says that upon my death, my entire estate will be donated to the Alzheimer's Association, the National Institute on Aging, and 3 local organizations that provide legal advocacy for elderly victims of financial abuse. The sound that came from Christopher's throat wasn't quite a scream, but it wasn't quite human either. Furthermore, I continued, the will specifically states that Marcus Nelson, Veronica Nelson Palmer, and Christopher Nelson are to receive nothing from my estate except for a $1 bequest each, to ensure that they cannot claim they were overlooked accidentally. Veronica stood up so quickly her chair tipped over backward. You can't do this, we're your children. Yes, you are my children. And you conspired to have me committed to a memory care facility so you could steal my money. These 2 facts are not mutually exclusive, Veronica. Marcus was reading the will now, his face growing darker with each page. This is insane. You're cutting us out of everything because of some misunderstanding? Misunderstanding? I stood up and walked around the desk until I was standing directly in front of him. Marcus, you met with an attorney to discuss having me declared mentally incompetent. You researched the legal process for obtaining guardianship over an elderly parent. You never once suggested that I see a doctor or get a professional evaluation. You went straight to the legal mechanism for stripping me of my rights and gaining control of my money. I turned to Veronica. You toured memory care facilities and asked specific questions about limiting my contact with the outside world. You didn't research assisted living communities or senior housing options. You researched places where people with severe dementia are kept under medical supervision with restricted freedom. Finally, I faced Christopher. And you promised your bookie that you'd have access to millions of dollars within a month, because your mother was finally losing it. You celebrated my supposed mental decline as a solution to your gambling debts. I walked back to my desk and sat down. So no, Marcus, this isn't about a misunderstanding. This is about betrayal. This is about three people who saw their mother as nothing more than an obstacle between them and a fortune they felt entitled to inherit. The room fell silent except for the sound of Christopher's labored breathing and the ticking of the grandfather clock. I gave them time to process what I'd told them, time to understand that their carefully constructed plan hadn't just failed. It had backfired so spectacularly that they'd lost everything they'd tried to gain. There is, however, one possibility for redemption, I said eventually. All three of them looked up with desperate hope. The will I just showed you becomes effective immediately. But it's not irreversible. I could, theoretically, prepare a new will that restores your inheritances. But such a decision would require some significant changes in our relationship. What kind of changes? Marcus asked carefully. I opened my desk drawer and removed 3 identical documents. These are contracts. Very simple contracts that outline the terms under which I might consider revising my will. I slid one contract to each of them. The terms are non-negotiable and non-transferable. If you sign, you agree to abide by them completely. If you violate any provision of the contract, you forfeit any claim to my estate permanently. Veronica picked up her contract and began reading. Her face went through several color changes as she worked her way through the pages. This says we have to attend weekly family dinners, she said incredulously. Every Sunday, 4 o'clock sharp for the remainder of my life. You will arrive on time, stay for the entire meal, and participate in polite conversation. No phones, no business calls, no excuses about prior commitments. Marcus was reading his contract now. Monthly financial disclosure? You want us to provide you with detailed reports of our income, expenses, and debts? I want transparency. If I'm going to leave you my money, I have the right to know how you handle the money you already have. Given your track records, this seems like a reasonable precaution. Christopher looked up from his contract with something approaching panic. Mandatory counseling for gambling addiction? You want me to see a therapist? I want you to address the behavior that led you to see my supposed mental decline as a lottery ticket. If you can't control your gambling, you'll lose my inheritance the same way you've lost everything else I've ever given you. I leaned back in my chair and watched them process the terms. The contracts were comprehensive and demanding, designed to rebuild the family relationships they'd been willing to destroy for money. But they were also designed to be just reasonable enough that my children might actually agree to them. These contracts also include some additional provisions, I continued. You will submit to annual cognitive evaluations performed by Dr. Foster, the same neurologist who confirmed my mental competency. If any of you ever again suggest that I'm mentally unfit, or if you attempt to interfere with my medical care or living arrangements, the contract is void and you forfeit your retirement inheritance. I stood up and walked to the window again. The hummingbirds had settled into a peaceful routine, taking turns at the feeder instead of fighting over it. Even creatures with brains the size of pearls could learn to coexist when they had to. You also agree to cease all contact with Harrison Wells or any other attorney regarding guardianship or competency proceedings. You will not research memory care facilities, assisted living communities, or any other residential options for me without my explicit written consent. And you will never again discuss my financial affairs with anyone outside this family without my permission. The silence stretched on for several minutes while they read and reread the contracts. I could practically hear the wheels turning in their heads as they weighed their options. They could refuse to sign and walk away with nothing. Or they could accept my terms and potentially inherit millions of dollars in exchange for behaving like decent human beings. What happens if we don't sign? Christopher asked finally. Then you leave my house and we never speak again. The will I showed you goes into effect, and when I die, my entire fortune goes to charity. You get your $1 bequests and whatever comfort you can derive from knowing that your greed cost you $50 million. Marcus set his contract down on the desk. This is blackmail. No, Marcus, this is consequence. Blackmail would be if I threatened to expose your cocaine habit to your employer unless you paid me money. This is me offering you a chance to salvage a relationship you were willing to destroy for financial gain. Veronica was crying again, but quietly this time. Mom, we're so sorry. We never meant for it to go this far. We were just scared about your future, and we handled it all wrong. You were scared about your financial future, Veronica. There's a difference. I sat back down at my desk and folded my hands. I'm going to give you exactly 1 week to decide. You can sign the contracts and agree to rebuild our family relationship on my terms. Or you can walk away and live with the consequences of your choices. But understand this. If you sign these contracts and then violate them, there will be no second chances. If you try to manipulate me again, if you lie to me again, if you ever again treat me like an obstacle to your inheritance, I will destroy you financially and legally, with resources you can't even imagine. I opened my desk drawer and removed 3 envelopes, each one sealed and marked with one of their names. These envelopes contain additional information about the extent of my knowledge regarding your individual situations. Marcus, yours includes documentation of your drug purchases and the impact they've had on your business ventures. Veronica, yours contains information about Brad's embezzlement that I'm certain you were aware of. Christopher, yours includes a complete record of your gambling debts and the threats you've received from various creditors. I placed the envelopes on the desk in front of them. I'm not giving these to you as threats. I'm giving them to you as reminders that I know who you really are, and I've chosen to love you anyway. But love has limits, and you've tested mine to the breaking point. The grandfather clock chimed 11:30, and I realized we'd been talking for more than an hour. An hour that had fundamentally changed the relationship between me and my children. Hopefully for the better, but possibly forever. I suggest you take your contracts home and read them carefully. Discuss them with your spouses if you want, but remember that these agreements are between you and me. No one else gets a vote in your decision. They stood up slowly, like people recovering from a long illness. Marcus picked up his contract and envelope first, followed by Veronica, and finally Christopher. They moved toward the door like sleepwalkers, still processing the magnitude of what had just happened. One more thing, I said as they reached the doorway. The van you hired to take me to Sunset Manor is still sitting at the end of my driveway. You might want to send it away before the neighbors start asking questions. After they left, I sat alone in my study for a long time, listening to the silence and trying to process my own emotions. I felt relieved that the confrontation was over, angry that it had been necessary in the first place, and sad that my relationship with my children had deteriorated to the point where legal contracts were required to ensure basic decency. But mostly, I felt proud. Proud that I'd seen through their deception, proud that I'd outmaneuvered their conspiracy, and proud that I'd stood up for myself when they'd expected me to go quietly into that memory care facility. I walked back to the safe and removed one more document, one I hadn't shown my children. It was a letter I'd written to myself 3 weeks ago, when I'd first confirmed the extent of their betrayal. In it, I'd outlined my strategy for protecting myself and my assets, but I'd also written about my hope that this confrontation might actually save my family rather than destroy it. The letter ended with a quote from Richard that I'd always treasured. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is to show them the consequences of their choices. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the safe. In 1 week, I'd know whether my children were capable of change, or whether I'd have to accept that the people I'd raised and loved had become strangers willing to trade my freedom for their financial security. Either way, I'd face that future with my dignity intact, my fortune secure, and my mind as sharp as it had ever been. And that, I reflected, was more than many people my age could say. The week that followed felt like living inside a pressure cooker. I maintained my normal routines: morning walks through the neighborhood, afternoon tea with my bridge club, evening phone calls with old friends. But underneath the surface calm, I was acutely aware that my children were somewhere out there wrestling with the most important decision of their lives. Elena called me twice during that week with updates on their activities. Marcus had been spotted entering Harrison Wells's office building on Wednesday afternoon, though Elena couldn't confirm whether he'd actually met with the attorney or simply lost his nerve in the elevator. Veronica had lunch with her sister-in-law Patricia on Thursday, a meeting that lasted nearly 3 hours and involved what Elena described as, quote, animated discussion and considerable tissue usage. Christopher, meanwhile, had apparently not left his condo for 4 consecutive days, ordering food delivery and ignoring calls from what Elena suspected were increasingly agitated creditors. The most interesting development came on Friday evening when Dr. Amanda Foster called me personally. She rarely contacted patients directly, preferring to work through her office staff, so I knew immediately that something unusual had prompted her call. "Mrs. Nelson," she said after the usual pleasantries, "I wanted to let you know that your son Marcus contacted my office today, requesting copies of your recent cognitive evaluation." I wasn't surprised, but I was curious about his approach. "What exactly did he tell your staff?" "He claimed to be acting as your healthcare proxy and said he needed the records for insurance purposes. When my receptionist asked for documentation of his authority to access your medical information, he became quite agitated and hung up. This told me that Marcus was either trying to find holes in my competency evaluation or hoping to discover some medical information he could use to challenge my mental fitness. Either way, it confirmed that he was still thinking like someone planning a legal challenge rather than someone considering genuine reconciliation." "Did he mention anything specific about the evaluation results?" "No, but he did ask whether the tests I administered would be considered definitive in a legal proceeding. My receptionist told him that all medical records require proper authorization, regardless of their intended use." I thanked Dr. Foster for the heads up and made a mental note to have Robert Chen contact her office about reinforcing the privacy protections around my medical records. If Marcus was still pursuing legal options, I wanted to make sure he couldn't access ammunition for a competency challenge. Saturday brought an unexpected visitor. I was in my greenhouse, repotting orchids that Richard had given me for our 25th anniversary, when I heard the doorbell. Through the glass walls, I could see a woman I didn't recognize standing on my front porch, holding what appeared to be a manila envelope. I answered the door to find a woman in her early 40s, professionally dressed but with the slightly frazzled appearance of someone who'd been driving around unfamiliar neighborhoods looking for addresses. "Mrs. Nelson? My name is Sandra Walsh. I'm a private investigator working for Harrison Wells's law firm." Interesting. Wells was sending investigators to my house now, which suggested that Marcus hadn't given up on the guardianship idea, despite everything that had happened in my study 6 days ago. "What can I do for you, Miss Walsh?" She consulted a tablet device before responding. "I'm conducting a routine welfare check as part of a potential guardianship evaluation. Your family has expressed concerns about your ability to live independently, and I've been asked to observe your living conditions and mental state." I almost laughed. They were trying to conduct surveillance disguised as a welfare check, probably hoping to document evidence of confusion, poor judgment, or unsafe living conditions. What they didn't realize was that I'd been expecting exactly this kind of maneuver. "I see. And what authority do you have to conduct this evaluation?" Sandra shifted uncomfortably. "Well, it's really just an informal assessment. Your son Marcus asked us to check on you because he's concerned about your safety." "Marcus asked you to check on me without my permission or knowledge?" "It's fairly routine in these situations. We just want to make sure you're okay." I opened the door wider and gestured for her to come inside. "By all means, Miss Walsh, please, conduct your evaluation. I'd hate for anyone to think I was trying to hide something." She seemed surprised by my cooperation, but she followed me into the foyer and began looking around with the practiced eye of someone trained to spot signs of elderly neglect or confusion. What she saw instead was a meticulously maintained home with fresh flowers, clean surfaces, and the kind of organized elegance that comes from decades of careful attention to detail. I led her through the main floor, pointing out recent improvements I'd made to the kitchen, the new security system I'd installed after Richard's death, and the small elevator I'd had built to access the second floor when my arthritis was particularly troublesome. Everything she saw contradicted the narrative of a confused, declining elderly woman who couldn't manage her own affairs. In the study, she noticed the safe behind the Mount Rainier painting. "Do you handle your own financial affairs, Mrs. Nelson?" "Absolutely. I've been managing my investments since before you were born, Miss Walsh. Would you like to see my portfolio performance over the last 5 years?" "I consistently outperform the market by 8 to 12% annually." She made notes on her tablet, though I could tell she was struggling to find anything that supported the concerns Marcus had presumably expressed about my competency. "Your son mentioned that you've been having memory problems." "Did he? How strange. My memory is excellent. For instance, I remember exactly when Marcus last visited before this week, February 14th, when he came to ask for money to cover losses from his latest restaurant venture. I remember the specific amount he requested, $250,000, and I remember exactly why I refused to give it to him. Sandra's pen paused over her tablet. Why did you refuse? Because it was the third time in 18 months he'd asked for money to cover business losses, and because I knew he was using cocaine again. I'm not in the habit of funding my children's addictions, Miss Walsh. The color drained from Sandra's face. This was clearly not the kind of information she'd expected to uncover during a routine welfare check. Are you making accusations about your son's drug use? I'm stating facts based on direct observation and documented evidence. Would you like to see the private investigator's report that details his purchases and usage patterns? She declined, though I could tell she was beginning to understand that this wasn't a confused elderly woman who needed protection. This was someone who'd been conducting her own investigation and had documentation to support her claims. We finished the tour in my greenhouse, where I explained the complex orchid care regimens I maintained for 37 different species. I showed her my detailed cultivation logs, my fertilization schedules, and the climate control system I'd designed to maintain optimal growing conditions year-round. This seems like quite a lot of work for someone with cognitive challenges, Sandra observed. Yes, it would be. Fortunately, I don't have cognitive challenges. I have children who'd like people to think I do. As we walked back toward the front door, Sandra seemed to be grappling with how to write a report that would satisfy her client while remaining truthful about what she'd observed. Mrs. Nelson, I have to ask, are you aware that your family is considering guardianship proceedings? Oh yes, Miss Walsh, I'm very aware. In fact, I have copies of the petition your client prepared, transcripts of conversations between my children discussing their plans, and documentation of their research into memory care facilities. I'm also aware that they've been conducting this entire conspiracy without ever having me evaluated by a medical professional. She stopped walking and stared at me. You have documentation of all that? Comprehensive documentation. Video surveillance, audio recordings, financial records, legal correspondence. Everything needed to demonstrate that this guardianship petition is based on fraudulent claims designed to facilitate financial exploitation. Sandra closed her tablet and looked at me with something approaching respect. Mrs. Nelson, I'm going to be honest with you. In 15 years of conducting these evaluations, I've never met someone who was more clearly competent to manage their own affairs. If your family proceeds with guardianship proceedings based on claims of cognitive decline, they're going to face serious legal consequences. I hope you'll include that assessment in your report to Mr. Wells. I will. And I'm going to recommend that he advise his clients to abandon any legal action immediately. After Sandra left, I called Elena to update her on this latest development. She wasn't surprised that Marcus was still pursuing legal options, but she was concerned about the escalation. If they're hiring investigators and still working with Wells, they're not planning to sign your contracts, she said. They're looking for ways to challenge your competency ruling and your new will. Then they're going to be very disappointed when they realize how thoroughly I've documented their conspiracy. Jackie, you need to be prepared for the possibility that they might try something more direct. If they're desperate enough to risk criminal charges for guardianship fraud, they might be desperate enough to try other approaches. Elena's warning proved prescient. On Sunday evening, exactly 1 week after I'd given my children their ultimatum, I received a call from Robert Chen's emergency number. Jackie, I'm sorry to call so late, but I thought you should know immediately. Harrison Wells filed an emergency petition this afternoon, requesting a mental health evaluation and temporary guardianship for you. He's claiming that you've been making irrational financial decisions and that your family is concerned about your immediate safety. I felt a familiar surge of anger, but this time it was cold and controlled. On what basis? The petition alleges that you've been giving away large sums of money to unknown recipients, that you've been expressing paranoid delusions about family members, and that you've been making threats against your children. The audacity was breathtaking. They'd twisted my gift of contracts, offering them a path back into my will into evidence of financial irrationality. They'd characterized my documentation of their conspiracy as paranoid delusions, and they'd somehow portrayed my offer of redemption as threats against them. When is the hearing scheduled? Tuesday morning. Judge Patricia Hoffman is presiding. The good news is that I know her reputation. She's thorough, fair, and doesn't tolerate fraudulent petitions. The bad news is that Wells has requested an immediate evaluation by a court-appointed psychiatrist. Let him. I'll submit to any evaluation they want. But I want Dr. Foster present as an observer, and I want Elena's investigation files entered as evidence. Already planning on it. Jackie, I have to ask, are you prepared for how ugly this might get? They're going to attack your character, your judgment, and your relationships with your children. They're going to paint you as a vindictive old woman who's using her money to manipulate her family. Robert, I've been preparing for this fight for weeks. Let them come. Monday morning brought a flurry of activity as Robert and his team prepared our defense. Elena arrived at my house at 8 o'clock sharp with 3 boxes of evidence, each one meticulously organized and labeled. Dr. Foster agreed to testify about my cognitive evaluation and to observe any court-ordered psychiatric assessment. Most importantly, I spent the morning reviewing my own documentation and preparing for what would likely be the most important performance of my life. The irony wasn't lost on me that my children, who'd spent months planning to have me declared mentally incompetent, had forced me into a situation where I'd have to prove my mental fitness to a room full of strangers. But I'd been proving myself to skeptical audiences for most of my adult life, first as Richard's business partner, and later as a widow managing a complex estate. A courtroom was just another boardroom, and I'd never lost a boardroom battle yet. That evening, Christopher called. It was the first direct contact I'd had with any of my children since they'd left my study the previous week, and I was curious to hear what he had to say. Mom, I want you to know that I didn't want things to go this far. Marcus and Veronica talked me into it, but I never wanted to take you to court. But you did want access to my money to pay your gambling debts. A long pause. Yeah, I did. And I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry about all of it. Sorry enough to testify truthfully at tomorrow's hearing? Another pause, even longer this time. I can't do that, Mom. Marcus says if we back down now, we'll never get another chance. He says you'll just keep holding the money over our heads forever. And what do you think, Christopher? I think I'm 45 years old and I've never done anything right in my entire life. I think I owe people money I can't possibly repay with my salary, and I think without your inheritance, I'm probably going to end up dead or in prison. His honesty was more painful than his lies had been. At least when he was lying, I could focus on my anger. His admission of desperation and failure forced me to confront the fact that I'd somehow raised a son who saw my death as his only path to financial salvation. Christopher, if you testify against me tomorrow, if you claim that I'm mentally unfit or financially irresponsible, I will never forgive you. Not just for the lies, but for choosing Marcus's manipulation over your own mother's love. I know, but I don't have a choice anymore. After he hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, drinking tea and watching the sun set behind the mountains. Tomorrow I would walk into a courtroom and fight for my freedom, my dignity, and my right to control my own life. I would face 3 children who'd decided that $50 million was worth more than their relationship with the woman who'd raised them. But tonight, I allowed myself to grieve for the family I'd thought I had, and for the children who'd chosen greed over love. Tuesday morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of Seattle day that makes everything look sharp-edged and brittle. I dressed carefully in a navy suit Richard had always said made me look both approachable and formidable, pinned my hair into a neat chignon, and applied makeup with the precision of someone preparing for battle. Elena arrived at 7:30 to drive me to the courthouse. During the 20-minute drive, she briefed me on what to expect from the proceedings and reminded me of the key points we needed to establish: my cognitive competency, the fraudulent nature of my children's claims, and the financial motivation behind their guardianship petition. Remember, she said as we pulled into the courthouse parking garage, they're going to try to provoke you into appearing angry, irrational, or vindictive. Stay calm, stick to facts, and let the evidence speak for itself. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill. Marcus, Veronica, and Christopher sat at a table with Harrison Wells, all of them dressed in dark colors like they were attending a funeral. In a way, they were. Judge Patricia Hoffman entered at exactly 9 o'clock, a woman in her late 50s with steel gray hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd heard every possible variation of family dysfunction and wasn't impressed by any of it. Wells presented his case first, painting a picture of a once competent woman whose mental faculties had declined to the point where she posed a danger to herself and her family. He introduced testimony from my children about my supposed confusion, memory lapses, and irrational financial decisions. He characterized my new will as evidence of vindictive irrationality and my documentation of their activities as paranoid delusions. Marcus testified that I'd become increasingly suspicious and aggressive over the past year, that I'd accused him of trying to steal from me without cause, and that I'd made threats about cutting them out of my inheritance over minor disagreements. His performance was polished and convincing, full of concern for my well-being and sorrow about my supposed decline. Veronica's testimony focused on my supposed inability to manage basic household tasks and my growing confusion about financial matters. She claimed that I'd forgotten to pay bills, had trouble operating household appliances, and had once called her in a panic because I couldn't remember where I'd put my car keys. Christopher's testimony was the most damaging, because it contained just enough truth to be believable. He testified that I'd become obsessed with the idea that my family was plotting against me, that I'd hired investigators to spy on my own children, and that I'd threatened to disinherit them unless they agreed to submit to my unreasonable demands and constant surveillance. Each of their testimonies was carefully crafted to present themselves as loving children concerned about an elderly mother who was losing her grip on reality. If I hadn't known the truth about their conspiracy, I might have found their performances convincing. When it was our turn, Robert began by introducing Dr. Foster's evaluation and having her testify about my cognitive competency. Her professional assessment was clear and unambiguous. I showed no signs of dementia, cognitive decline, or impaired judgment. My test scores were well within normal ranges for someone my age, and in several areas, I'd performed better than the average for people 20 years younger. Then Elena took the stand and methodically dismantled my children's narrative. She presented photographs of their meetings with Wells, transcripts of Christopher's phone calls about gaining access to my accounts, and documentation of their research into memory care facilities. She explained how their conspiracy had unfolded over several months, with each of them playing specific roles in building a case for my supposed incompetency. The courtroom was dead silent as Elena read Christopher's recorded conversation about celebrating my mental decline as a solution to his gambling debts. I watched my son's face as his own words echoed through the courtroom, and for the first time since this nightmare began, he looked genuinely ashamed. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the witness stand with my spine straight and my voice steady. Robert guided me through my background, my education, my role in building the family fortune, and my continued management of complex financial affairs. I spoke about my daily routines, my social activities, and my ongoing involvement in charitable organizations that required sophisticated decision-making and strategic planning. Then I told the truth about my children's conspiracy. Not with anger or vindictiveness, but with the cold precision of someone presenting facts to a business meeting. I explained how I'd discovered their plan, how I'd investigated their activities, and how I'd prepared evidence to protect myself from their fraudulent guardianship petition. Your Honor, I said in conclusion, I don't dispute that my children want control of my money. What I dispute is their claim that I'm mentally unfit to manage my own affairs. The evidence shows that I'm not only competent, but that I was alert enough to detect and document their conspiracy months before they put their plan into action. During cross-examination, Wells tried to portray my investigation as evidence of paranoid thinking, but his questions only served to highlight the thoroughness and accuracy of my evidence gathering. When he suggested that my new will was proof of impaired judgment, I responded that disinheriting children who'd conspired to have me falsely committed seemed like perfectly rational decision-making. The court-appointed psychiatrist, Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, conducted her evaluation during a lunch recess. She administered several cognitive tests, asked detailed questions about my daily life and decision-making processes, and spent considerable time reviewing my medical history and current medications. After 90 minutes, she concluded that I showed no signs of cognitive impairment, mental illness, or diminished capacity. When court reconvened, Judge Hoffman delivered her ruling with the kind of judicial anger I suspected she reserved for the most egregious cases. This petition represents one of the most clear-cut cases of attempted elder abuse I've seen in 20 years on the bench, she began. The evidence shows that the petitioners conspired to have Mrs. Nelson declared mentally incompetent based on fabricated claims of cognitive decline, with the apparent goal of gaining control of her substantial estate. She looked directly at my children as she continued. The testimony presented by the respondents' children appears to have been largely fictitious, contradicted by professional medical evaluation, direct evidence of their conspiracy, and Mrs. Nelson's own clearly demonstrated competency. The judge not only dismissed the guardianship petition, but ordered Wells to pay court costs, and referred the matter to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges related to elder abuse and fraud. She also issued a restraining order preventing my children from filing any future competency or guardianship petitions without clear medical evidence of cognitive decline. As the courtroom emptied, my children walked past me without making eye contact. Marcus was speaking in urgent whispers to Wells, probably trying to understand the legal consequences of their failed conspiracy. Veronica was crying again, but these were tears of fear, rather than manipulation. Christopher looked like a man who'd finally run out of options and was beginning to understand the magnitude of what he'd lost. Outside the courthouse, Elena and Robert flanked me like bodyguards as we walked to the parking garage. The Seattle sky had turned overcast while we'd been inside, and the afternoon light had a gray, filtered quality that seemed appropriate for the end of my relationship with my children. "What happens now?" I asked Robert as we reached his car. "Now you go home and live your life," he said. "The restraining order protects you from future legal harassment, and the criminal referral sends a message that this kind of behavior has serious consequences. And my children? That depends on them. They've burned their bridges with you, but they haven't necessarily burned their bridges with the law. If they stay away from you and don't attempt any similar schemes, they'll probably face minimal criminal consequences." I looked back at the courthouse building, where I'd just finished defending my right to control my own life against the 3 people who should have been protecting it. "I gave them a chance to make this right," I said. "I offered them contracts that would have restored their inheritances in exchange for basic decency and respect. Instead, they chose to double down on their conspiracy and take me to court." Elena nodded grimly. "Some people only understand consequences, Jackie. Your children have spent their entire lives believing that your love meant they were entitled to your money. Today they learned the difference." As we drove back to my house, I felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. I'd won a decisive victory against people who'd tried to steal my freedom and my fortune, but the victory felt hollow because those people were my own children. I'd protected myself successfully, but I'd also lost the family I'd spent 50 years building. But I'd also learned something important about myself. At 78 years old, I was still capable of fighting for what was mine, still smart enough to outmaneuver people who underestimated me, and still strong enough to accept painful consequences when they were necessary. That evening, I sat in my garden watching the hummingbirds and thinking about the future. I had my freedom, my fortune, and my independence, but I also had the knowledge that my children had been willing to trade all of that for money they hadn't earned and didn't deserve. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of building a new life. One that didn't include the people who'd seen my supposed vulnerability as an opportunity for theft. It wasn't the future I'd planned, but it was a future I could face with dignity intact and my head held high. The morning after the court victory, I woke to an unusual silence. For months, I'd been living with the constant undercurrent of anxiety that comes from knowing people are plotting against you. Now, with the legal threat eliminated and my children's conspiracy exposed, that tension had simply evaporated. I lay in bed for an extra hour, not because I was tired, but because I could. For the first time since Christmas, I had no urgent phone calls to make, no evidence to review, no strategies to plan. I was simply a 78-year-old woman in her own house, free to spend the day however she chose. My first choice was coffee on the back patio, where I could watch the morning light filter through the Douglas firs that Richard had planted when we'd first moved to this house 32 years ago. The trees had been saplings then, barely taller than I was. Now they towered over the roof, their branches home to generations of squirrels, ravens, and the occasional hawk that kept my neighbor's cat population in check. As I sat there, sipping coffee from the china cup that had belonged to Richard's grandmother, I realized I was experiencing something I hadn't felt in years: genuine peace. Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of something deeper. The knowledge that I'd faced the worst betrayal imaginable and emerged not just intact, but stronger. My phone rang at exactly 8:30, and I recognized Elena's number immediately. "Good morning, Jackie. How are you feeling today?" "Like I just survived a hurricane and discovered my house is still standing." Elena laughed, the first genuinely relaxed sound I'd heard from her in weeks. "That's actually a pretty accurate metaphor. I wanted to update you on some developments from yesterday's hearing." "Good developments or concerning ones?" "Mostly good. Harrison Wells has withdrawn from representing your children, and his firm issued a statement distancing themselves from the guardianship petition. Apparently they're concerned about potential malpractice claims and barred discipline proceedings. This didn't surprise me. Wells had built his reputation on legitimate elder law cases, not fraudulent conspiracy schemes. Being publicly associated with my children's failed plot could damage his practice significantly." "What about the criminal referral?" "The district attorney's office has opened a preliminary investigation. They'll likely interview you, your children, and Wells over the next few weeks. It's possible they'll file charges for attempted elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy, but that decision will depend on how cooperative everyone is with the investigation." I asked Elena what she meant by cooperative, and her answer was enlightening. Apparently, Marcus and Veronica had already contacted the DA's office through new attorneys, expressing willingness to provide full disclosure about their actions in exchange for reduced charges or immunity. Christopher, meanwhile, had disappeared entirely, failing to return calls from his siblings, his attorney, or the investigators. "It sounds like your children are finally starting to understand the serious legal consequences of what they attempted," Elena said. "Marcus and Veronica seem to be trying to minimize their liability by cooperating with authorities. Christopher is either in complete denial or planning something desperate." After Elena hung up, I found myself thinking about Christopher's disappearance. Of my 3 children, he'd always been the most impulsive, the one most likely to make catastrophically poor decisions when cornered. His gambling addiction had already demonstrated his capacity for self-destructive behavior, and now he was facing the loss of his inheritance, potential criminal charges, and creditors who were undoubtedly growing more aggressive by the day. I called Robert Chen to discuss my concerns about Christopher's state of mind and my legal options for protecting myself if he decided to take more direct action. Robert assured me that the restraining order provided significant protection, but he also recommended upgrading my home security system and perhaps hiring a personal security consultant for a few weeks. "Jackie, I've seen desperate people do desperate things when they feel like they have nothing left to lose," he said. "Christopher has significant gambling debts, no legitimate access to your money, and now potential criminal charges hanging over his head. That's a dangerous combination." I spent the afternoon walking through my house, really seeing it for the first time in months, rather than simply moving through it while focused on other concerns. Room by room, I noticed details that had escaped my attention during the crisis. The way afternoon sunlight revealed dust motes dancing in the library, the small chip in the marble mantelpiece where Christopher had thrown a toy car during a tantrum at age 7, the faded rectangle on the living room wall where Richard's portrait had hung before I'd moved it to the bedroom after his death. This house held 40 years of memories, most of them happy. Family dinners, where conversation flowed as freely as wine, Christmas mornings with wrapping paper scattered across the Persian rugs, birthday parties and graduation celebrations, and quiet evenings, when Richard and I would sit by the fireplace planning our future together. My children had been genuinely joyful here once, before entitlement and resentment had poisoned their hearts. The irony wasn't lost on me that in trying to steal this house through their guardianship conspiracy, they'd forfeited any claim to the memories it contained. This was no longer their childhood home. It was simply another asset they'd failed to acquire through deception. That evening brought an unexpected visitor. I was in the kitchen preparing a simple dinner when the doorbell rang, and I looked through the peephole to see Patricia Morrison, Veronica's sister-in-law, standing on my front porch with what appeared to be a casserole dish. Patricia and I had always maintained a cordial relationship, though we'd never been particularly close. She was a practical woman who worked as a nurse practitioner and had always struck me as having more sense than most of the family members who'd married into our drama-prone clan. I opened the door, curious about what had brought her here less than 24 hours after the court hearing. "Hello, Jackie. I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced. I brought you some lasagna. I thought you might not feel like cooking after yesterday." Her thoughtfulness was unexpected and genuinely touching. I invited her in and led her to the kitchen, where she set the casserole dish on the counter and turned to face me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Patricia, I have to ask, does Veronica know you're here?" She shook her head. "Veronica doesn't know, and I'd prefer to keep it that way for now. I came because I needed to tell you something that I probably should have told you months ago." I poured 2 glasses of iced tea and gestured for her to sit at the kitchen table. Patricia had never been one for unnecessary drama, so whatever she'd come to discuss was likely important. "Back in January," she began, "David and I had dinner with Veronica and Brad. During the meal, Veronica started talking about your supposed memory problems and how worried she was about your ability to live independently." Patricia paused to sip her tea, clearly choosing her words carefully. "The thing is, Jackie, the examples she gave didn't match the woman I'd observed at family gatherings. You'd always been sharp, organized, completely on top of everything." So I asked her some pointed questions about these alleged incidents of confusion and forgetfulness. "What kind of questions?" "Specific ones. When did these episodes occur? What exactly did you say or do that seemed confused? Had she discussed her concerns with your doctor or with Marcus and Christopher?" Patricia's expression grew troubled. Her answers were vague and inconsistent. She couldn't provide specific dates or details, and when I suggested that she should encourage you to see a neurologist if she was genuinely concerned, she got defensive and changed the subject. This confirmed what I'd already suspected, that Veronica had been manufacturing evidence of my supposed cognitive decline rather than observing genuine symptoms. "Did you share your suspicions with anyone?" I mentioned it to David, and we both agreed that something felt off about the whole conversation. But we didn't know how to approach you about it without potentially creating family drama over what might have been a misunderstanding. Patricia reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I'm so sorry, Jackie. If I'd spoken up then, maybe I could have prevented what happened yesterday." I assured her that she bore no responsibility for my children's conspiracy, but her revelation did provide valuable context for understanding how long Veronica had been laying groundwork for the guardianship petition. "There's something else," Patricia continued. "After the court hearing yesterday, Veronica called me in tears. She's terrified about the criminal investigation and convinced that she's going to prison." "What did you tell her?" I told her the truth, that she brought this on herself by participating in a scheme to defraud her own mother. But I also told her that if she was genuinely remorseful and willing to make amends, she should focus on cooperating with the investigation and trying to repair the damage she'd done to your relationship. Patricia finished her tea and looked at me with the direct gaze I'd always appreciated about her. "Jackie, I know you have every right to never speak to your children again after what they put you through. But I also know that cutting them out of your life completely will cause you pain, even if you don't want to admit it right now." I asked her what she thought I should do, and her answer surprised me with its pragmatism. "I think you should let them face the consequences of their actions without trying to shield them from the legal or financial fallout. But I also think you should leave the door open for genuine reconciliation if they ever demonstrate real remorse and meaningful change." After Patricia left, I found myself thinking about her suggestion that I leave the door open for reconciliation. My rational mind knew that my children had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed, had broken trust that couldn't be easily repaired. But my heart, the part of me that remembered rocking them through fevers and cheering at their school plays, wasn't quite ready to declare them permanently dead to me. The next few days passed quietly, with only routine calls from Robert's office updating me on the criminal investigation's progress. Marcus and Veronica had indeed hired new attorneys, and were cooperating fully with investigators, providing detailed accounts of their conspiracy and accepting responsibility for their actions. Christopher, however, remained missing, and his attorney had withdrawn from representing him after being unable to establish contact. On Friday morning, I received a call that changed the peaceful trajectory of my week entirely. It was Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the court-appointed psychiatrist who'd evaluated me during the guardianship hearing. "Mrs. Nelson, I'm calling because I've received a concerning communication that I felt you should know about immediately." My first thought was that Christopher had contacted her, possibly to challenge her competency evaluation or to provide new information about my supposed mental state. "Christopher Nelson called my office yesterday evening and requested an appointment. When my receptionist asked about the nature of his concerns, he claimed that you'd been making threats against him and his family, and that you'd hired people to harass and intimidate him." I felt a familiar surge of anger, but it was tempered by genuine concern about Christopher's mental state. If he was calling psychiatrists with paranoid claims about harassment and intimidation, he was either planning another legal challenge or experiencing some kind of psychological break brought on by the stress of his situation. Did he make an appointment? Number. When my receptionist explained that I couldn't discuss my evaluation of you with family members and suggested that he contact his own physician if he was experiencing distress, he became agitated and hung up. Dr. Morrison paused before continuing. "Mrs. Nelson, in my professional opinion, your son sounded like someone under extreme psychological stress. His speech patterns suggested possible substance use, and his claims about threats and harassment struck me as potentially delusional." She recommended that I document the call and share the information with my attorney and security consultant, particularly given Christopher's history of gambling addiction and his current financial desperation. After hanging up with Dr. Morrison, I immediately called Elena to report Christopher's contact with the psychiatrist. Elena's response was swift and decisive. She would intensify her monitoring of Christopher's activities and work with my security consultant to evaluate potential threats to my safety. "Jackie, people in Christopher's situation, facing financial ruin, criminal charges, and the loss of a major inheritance, sometimes make extremely poor decisions. We need to take this seriously." That afternoon, I met with Thomas Bradley, the security consultant Robert had recommended. Thomas was a former police detective who specialized in personal protection for high-net-worth individuals, and his assessment of my situation was both thorough and sobering. "The good news is that your house is already well secured with quality locks, surveillance cameras, and a monitored alarm system," he said as we walked through my property. "The concerning news is that Christopher knows all of your routines, has intimate knowledge of your security measures, and presumably still has keys to the house." Thomas recommended several immediate changes: new locks on all doors, additional motion sensors in the garden areas where someone could approach unseen, and a panic room system that would allow me to secure myself and contact authorities if necessary. He also suggested varying my daily routines and avoiding predictable patterns like weekly grocery shopping or regular social commitments. "I'm not trying to make you paranoid," he assured me, "but desperate people do desperate things, and Christopher has every reason to feel desperate right now." I spent the weekend implementing Thomas's security recommendations and thinking about how dramatically my life had changed in just a few weeks. A month ago, my biggest concerns had been choosing plants for the spring garden and organizing my annual charity auction. Now I was installing panic buttons and considering whether it was safe to attend my bridge club meetings. The strangest part was how normal everything felt despite the underlying tension. I still woke up each morning, still tended my orchids, still cooked my meals and read my books. The threat of danger existed alongside ordinary life rather than overwhelming it, which somehow made it feel both more manageable and more surreal. On Monday morning, Elena called with news that explained Christopher's recent erratic behavior and provided disturbing context for Dr. Morrison's concerns about his mental state. Christopher was arrested Sunday night on charges related to his gambling debts, she reported. Apparently, he'd borrowed money from some very unsavory people and had been making increasingly desperate attempts to pay them back. The details Elena had gathered painted a picture of someone whose desperation had led him into genuinely dangerous territory. Christopher had apparently convinced his creditors that he would inherit millions within weeks, using that promise to secure additional loans with terms that bordered on extortion. When the inheritance failed to materialize after the court hearing, these creditors had become increasingly aggressive in their collection efforts. He was picked up after trying to sell information about your home's security to someone who turned out to be an undercover police officer. Elena continued. The working theory is that he was planning some kind of burglary or robbery to get money to pay his debts. The revelation that Christopher had been willing to provide information that could facilitate a crime against me represented a new level of betrayal. It was one thing to conspire with his siblings to have me declared incompetent. That was greed and desperation, but it wasn't necessarily dangerous. Providing intelligence for what could have been a violent crime against me crossed into territory that even my mother's love couldn't easily forgive. Where is he now? Jail, and likely to stay there for a while. The charges are serious, and given his history of poor decisions and current financial situation, he's considered a flight risk. His bail hearing is scheduled for Wednesday. Elena's information provided some measure of relief, but it also forced me to confront the reality that my youngest child, the baby I'd rocked through colic and cheered through Little League games, had become someone capable of facilitating violence against me for money. That evening I received a call from Marcus. It was the first time I had heard from him since the court hearing, and his voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. Not just shame, but genuine fear. "Mom, I heard about Christopher's arrest. I wanted to call because I'm worried about what he might have told people about you, about the house, about your routines." "Why do you care, Marcus?" "Last week you were willing to have me committed to a memory care facility so you could steal my money. Because no matter what I've done, I don't want you to get hurt. And Christopher..." "Mom, Christopher isn't thinking clearly anymore. The gambling, the debt, the stress. I think he's having some kind of breakdown." Marcus's concern might have been genuine, but I wasn't prepared to trust his motives without verification. Too much had happened. Too many lies had been told for me to accept his words at face value. "What exactly are you worried he might have told people?" "He knows your schedule, your security codes, where you keep valuable items. If he shared that information with the wrong people..." Marcus's voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. "And why should I believe that you're concerned about my safety rather than your own legal liability?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Because Veronica and I have been meeting with attorneys all week, trying to understand the potential criminal charges we're facing, and every lawyer we've talked to has said the same thing, that our actions were inexcusable and that we're likely going to face serious consequences." He paused again, and when he continued, his voice was thick with emotion. "Mom, we fucked up. We fucked up so badly that I don't know if we can ever fix it. But regardless of what happens to us, I don't want Christopher's desperation to put you in physical danger." I told Marcus I would take his concerns into consideration, but that any future communication between us would need to go through attorneys. I wasn't ready to have direct conversations with him about anything more substantive than immediate safety concerns. After hanging up, I called Thomas Bradley to update him on Christopher's arrest and Marcus's warning about potentially compromised security information. Thomas's response was swift and decisive. He would arrange for a complete security overhaul, including new codes, additional cameras, and temporary increased patrols around my property. "The good news is that Christopher is in custody," Thomas said. "The bad news is that if he shared detailed information about your security with the wrong people, we need to assume that information is still out there." The next few days passed in a blur of security consultations, system installations, and conversations with attorneys about the evolving criminal investigation. I felt like I was living in the center of a storm that had been brewing for months and was only now reaching its full intensity. On Thursday afternoon, I received a call from an assistant district attorney named Sarah Chen, no relation to Robert, despite the shared surname. She wanted to schedule a formal interview as part of the criminal investigation into my children's conspiracy. "Mrs. Nelson, based on the evidence we've reviewed so far, it appears that you were the target of a sophisticated conspiracy to defraud you of your assets and civil rights. We'd like to get your detailed account of how you discovered the plot and what evidence you gathered." The interview was scheduled for the following Monday. giving me a weekend to prepare my testimony and review the extensive documentation I'd assembled over the past months. It felt appropriate somehow that the same meticulous record-keeping that had protected me from my children's conspiracy would now be used to ensure they faced appropriate consequences for their actions. On Saturday evening, as I sat in my garden watching the sun set behind the mountains, I reflected on how much my life had changed since that morning when Marcus, Veronica, and Christopher had arrived with their van and their carefully rehearsed expressions of concern. They'd expected to find a confused, vulnerable old woman who could be easily manipulated into giving up her freedom and her fortune. Instead, they'd encountered someone who'd been watching them, documenting their conspiracy, and preparing her own counterattack with the patience of a chess master planning 20 moves ahead. They'd underestimated not just my mental acuity, but my willingness to fight back when threatened. The hummingbirds were settling into their evening routine, taking final turns at the feeder before finding their roosting spots for the night. Their territorial disputes had become more civilized over the weeks I'd been watching them, as if they'd learned to share resources rather than fighting constantly over them. I wondered if my children would ever learn similar lessons about cooperation and respect, or if their greed and entitlement had poisoned them beyond redemption. The optimistic part of me hoped that facing real consequences might finally teach them the values I'd failed to instill during their upbringing. The realistic part of me suspected that people who could conspire to steal their mother's freedom were unlikely to experience genuine moral awakening. As darkness settled over the garden, I made my way back into the house, secure in the knowledge that it was truly mine. Protected by law, defended by excellent security, and inhabited by someone who'd proven herself capable of fighting for what she'd earned. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conversations with attorneys and investigators, new steps in the long process of ensuring that my children faced appropriate consequences for their betrayal. But tonight, I was simply a 78-year-old woman in her own home, free to spend her evening however she chose. I chose to pour myself a glass of the wine Richard and I had been saving for a special occasion, to sit by the fireplace with a book I'd been meaning to read, and to savor the profound satisfaction that comes from defeating people who'd counted on your weakness only to discover your strength. The special occasion, I realized, was survival. I'd survived my children's conspiracy, survived their legal challenge, and emerged not just intact but victorious. That seemed like exactly the kind of occasion Richard would have wanted us to celebrate, even if I had to raise the glass alone. The interview with Assistant District Attorney Sarah Chen took place in a conference room on the 15th floor of the King County Courthouse, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Elliott Bay. I arrived 15 minutes early, as was my habit for important meetings, and spent those extra minutes watching ferries navigate between the islands while mentally organizing the story I was about to tell. Sarah Chen was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 40s, with the kind of focused intensity that suggested she'd built her career on meticulous preparation and attention to detail. She was accompanied by Detective Maria Santos, a veteran investigator who specialized in financial crimes against the elderly, and a court reporter whose fingers moved across her stenotype machine with mechanical precision. Mrs. Nelson, thank you for coming in today. I know this has been an incredibly difficult situation for you, and we appreciate your cooperation with our investigation. Sarah opened a thick folder and removed several documents, arranging them carefully on the conference table. I recognized some of them: copies of the evidence Elena had gathered, transcripts of phone conversations, photographs of my children's meetings with Harrison Wells. Before we begin, I want you to know that based on our investigation so far, we're prepared to file criminal charges against all 3 of your children. The specific charges will depend partly on the information you provide today, but we're looking at conspiracy to defraud an elderly person, attempted financial exploitation, and filing false legal documents. The weight of those words settled over me like a heavy blanket. For months, I'd been focused on protecting myself from my children's conspiracy, but I hadn't fully processed the reality that they would face criminal consequences for their actions. Hearing it stated so matter-of-factly by a prosecutor made it real in a way that all my planning and preparation hadn't. I want to be clear about something, I said before Sarah could continue. I didn't pursue this investigation to see my children go to prison. I pursued it to protect myself from theft and false imprisonment. But I also want them to understand that their actions have serious consequences. Sarah nodded with the understanding of someone who'd handled many family-based financial crimes. That's a common sentiment among victims in these cases. The goal isn't punishment for its own sake. It's accountability and prevention of future harm. Over the next 3 hours, I walked them through the entire conspiracy from my perspective. I explained how I'd first noticed the subtle changes in my children's behavior, how I'd discovered their meetings and research into memory care facilities, and how I'd hired Elena to document their activities. I described the morning they'd arrived with the van, the confrontation in my study, and the subsequent legal battle that had culminated in Judge Hoffman's scathing dismissal of their guardianship petition. Detective Santos asked detailed questions about the timeline, the specific conversations I'd had with each child, and the evidence I'd gathered to protect myself. Her questions were thorough but respectful, and I could tell she understood both the legal implications of what had happened and the emotional devastation it had caused. Mrs. Nelson, in your opinion, was this conspiracy motivated primarily by financial desperation, or was there an element of malice toward you personally? It was a perceptive question, one that got to the heart of what had made this betrayal so painful. I thought carefully before answering. I think it started with financial desperation, particularly with Christopher's gambling debts and Marcus's failed business ventures. But it evolved into something more calculated and cruel. They weren't just trying to access my money. They were planning to strip me of my autonomy, my dignity, and my freedom to live in my own home. I paused, choosing my words carefully. The most hurtful part wasn't that they wanted my inheritance. It was that they were willing to have me declared mentally incompetent and locked away to get it. They were prepared to sacrifice my fundamental human rights for their financial benefit. Sarah made notes as I spoke, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. When I finished describing the conspiracy itself, she shifted to questions about the impact it had on my life and my ongoing concerns about safety. We're aware of Christopher's recent arrest and the charges he's facing related to his gambling debts. Are you concerned that his financial desperation might lead him to take more direct action against you? I'm concerned about what he might have told his creditors about my home, my routines, and my security measures. Christopher knows intimate details about my life that could be valuable to someone planning a robbery or worse. Detective Santos leaned forward. We've interviewed Christopher since his arrest, and he's been uncooperative with our investigation. He's denied any wrongdoing related to the guardianship conspiracy and claimed that you've been harassing and intimidating him. This didn't surprise me, given Christopher's pattern of deflecting responsibility for his actions. But it did concern me that he was still attempting to manipulate the narrative even from jail. What has he said specifically? He's claimed that you hired private investigators to spy on him and his siblings without cause, that you've made threats about disinheriting them over minor family disagreements, and that the guardianship petition was filed out of genuine concern for your mental health. Sarah consulted her notes before continuing. He's also suggested that your cognitive evaluation was somehow fraudulent or coerced, though he hasn't provided any evidence to support that claim. I felt a familiar surge of anger at Christopher's continued attempts to portray himself as a victim, but I kept my voice level as I responded. Christopher is lying, as he has been throughout this entire situation. I have documentation of every aspect of this conspiracy, including recorded conversations where he explicitly discusses gaining access to my accounts to pay his gambling debts. After the formal interview concluded, Sarah walked me to the elevator and provided an overview of what would happen next in the criminal proceedings. We'll likely file charges within the next 2 weeks. Marcus and Veronica will probably accept plea agreements in exchange for their cooperation. But Christopher's situation is more complicated, given his other legal problems and his refusal to accept responsibility. She handed me her business card and assured me that victim services would be available throughout the prosecution process. Mrs. Nelson, I want you to know that cases like this are unfortunately becoming more common as our population ages and wealth transfers become larger. What you did, documenting the conspiracy and fighting back legally, probably prevented similar crimes against other elderly victims. That evening, I sat in my study reviewing the day's events and thinking about the prosecutor's observation that my case might prevent future crimes. It hadn't occurred to me during the months of investigation and legal battles that my situation could have broader implications beyond protecting my own assets and freedom. The next morning brought a call from Elena with an update that significantly changed the landscape of the criminal case. Jackie, Marcus, and Veronica have both accepted plea agreements with the prosecutor's office. They'll plead guilty to conspiracy charges in exchange for suspended sentences, restitution payments, and mandatory counseling. This meant they would avoid prison time, but would have criminal records and would be required to pay financial damages for the costs of the investigation and my legal defense. More importantly, their guilty pleas would provide additional evidence against Christopher if his case went to trial. What about Christopher? He's rejected all plea offers and is demanding a jury trial. His new attorney is apparently planning to argue that he was mentally incompetent due to gambling addiction and financial stress, and that his actions were the result of psychological impairment rather than criminal intent. The irony was breathtaking. Christopher was planning to use the same defense, mental incompetency, that he'd tried to falsely apply to me. The difference was that his claim might actually have some merit, given his history of addiction and increasingly erratic behavior. How long before his trial? Probably 6 to 8 months, assuming his attorney doesn't file for additional delays. In the meantime, he'll remain in jail since he can't make bail. That afternoon, I received an unexpected visit from Veronica. I saw her car pull into my driveway and debated whether to answer the door. We hadn't spoken since the court hearing, and I wasn't sure I was ready for whatever conversation she'd come to have. When I opened the door, I was struck by how much she'd changed in just a few weeks. She looked older, more fragile, and her usual polished appearance had been replaced by the slightly disheveled look of someone under tremendous stress. "Mom, I know you probably don't want to see me, but I needed to talk to you before the plea hearing tomorrow." I invited her in, more out of curiosity than affection. We sat in the living room where I'd spent so many pleasant evenings during the years when I'd thought we were a normal, loving family. "I wanted to apologize," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not because my lawyer told me to, not because it might help with sentencing, but because I'm genuinely sorry for what we did to you." I studied her face, looking for signs of the manipulation that had characterized so many of our recent interactions. What I saw instead was exhaustion, and what appeared to be genuine remorse. I keep thinking about that morning when we came here with the van, when we acted like we were doing you a favor by taking away your freedom. I keep remembering the look on your face when you realized what we were planning. Veronica's voice broke slightly. "I've been seeing a therapist as part of the plea agreement, and she's helped me understand that what we did wasn't just theft, it was a form of abuse. We were treating you like an obstacle instead of a person." "Why, Veronica? Why were you willing to have me locked away for money you hadn't earned?" She was quiet for a long time before answering. "I think we started believing our own lies. We told ourselves you were declining mentally because it made the plan seem justified. We convinced ourselves that managing your money was a burden we were taking on for your benefit." She looked around the living room, taking in the family photographs and mementos that represented decades of shared history. "But mostly, I think we stopped seeing you as our mother and started seeing you as a bank account with an expiration date. And that's unforgivable." We talked for another hour, and I found myself experiencing a complex mixture of emotions. I was still angry about the betrayal, still hurt by the callousness they'd shown in planning my imprisonment. But I was also relieved to finally hear one of my children acknowledge the full scope of what they'd done without deflection or excuses. "What happens now?" I asked as she prepared to leave. "Now I face the consequences of my choices. The plea agreement, the criminal record, the knowledge that I nearly destroyed my relationship with the person who raised me." She paused at the door. "I don't expect forgiveness, Mom. I just wanted you to know that I understand what we did, and I'm sorry." After Veronica left, I walked through my house thinking about forgiveness and redemption. Part of me wanted to maintain my anger, to hold on to the hurt as protection against future betrayal. But another part of me recognized that carrying that weight indefinitely would damage me more than it would punish them. Over the following weeks, I settled into a new routine that reflected both my enhanced security precautions and my desire to reclaim a normal life. I varied my schedule to avoid predictable patterns, but I also made sure to maintain the social and charitable activities that gave my life meaning. I attended my Bridge Club meetings, continued my work with 3 local nonprofits, and even began volunteering with an organization that provided legal advocacy for elderly victims of financial abuse. The volunteer work proved unexpectedly healing. Listening to other women describe similar experiences of betrayal by family members helped me understand that my situation, while devastating, wasn't unique. More importantly, helping others navigate the legal and emotional challenges of financial exploitation gave me a sense of purpose that went beyond my own recovery. Marcus called twice during this period. Brief conversations focused primarily on logistics related to the criminal case. His tone was respectful but distant, as if he understood that rebuilding any kind of relationship would require time and sustained effort on his part. I appreciated his restraint. Grand gestures or emotional appeals would have felt manipulative given everything that had happened. Christopher, meanwhile, remained in jail and continued to refuse all plea offers. According to Elena's sources, his attorney was building a defense based on diminished capacity due to gambling addiction. But the strategy seemed unlikely to succeed given the extensive evidence of premeditation and planning. 3 months after the court hearing, I received a letter that surprised me with its source and its contents. It was from Patricia Morrison, Veronica's sister-in-law, but it wasn't about my children at all. "Dear Jackie," the letter began, "I've been thinking about our conversation regarding forgiveness and redemption, and I wanted to share something that might interest you. There's a woman in my neighborhood, Eleanor Walsh, whose situation reminds me very much of yours." Patricia went on to describe a 74-year-old widow whose son and daughter-in-law were pressuring her to sell her home and move into assisted living so they could access her equity for their own financial problems. Eleanor had reached out to Patricia for advice after learning about my case through mutual acquaintances. "I gave her your contact information, with your permission implied, since you've been so open about helping other families facing similar situations. I hope you don't mind, but I thought you might be able to provide guidance that could prevent her from experiencing what you went through." I called Eleanor that same evening, and we talked for over an hour about her situation and the warning signs she should watch for. Her children's pressure tactics were still in the early stages, but the pattern was familiar: expressions of concern about her ability to maintain her home, suggestions that she was becoming a burden, and subtle attempts to gain access to her financial information. "The thing is," Eleanor said, "I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. I've been balancing my checkbook for 50 years. I keep my house in excellent condition, and I have an active social life. But they keep insisting that I'm too old to live alone safely." I shared my experience with documentation and legal protection, and I connected Eleanor with Robert Chen for a consultation about preventative measures she could take to protect herself from future manipulation. "The most important thing," I told her, "is to trust your instincts. If something feels wrong about their behavior, it probably is. Don't let them convince you that their concern is more valid than your own judgment about your capabilities." That conversation led to several others as word spread about my willingness to help families dealing with similar situations. Within 6 months, I was regularly consulting with attorneys, social workers, and families about elder financial abuse prevention and intervention. The work was emotionally challenging but deeply satisfying. Each case reminded me of how vulnerable elderly people could be to exploitation by family members, but it also demonstrated that with proper preparation and legal support, these crimes could be prevented or stopped. 1 year after the confrontation in my study, I received notification that Christopher's trial had been scheduled for the following month. His attorney had exhausted all delay tactics and procedural challenges, and the case would finally move forward. Elena asked if I wanted to attend the trial, and I considered the question carefully. Part of me felt obligated to be present, to see the legal process through to its conclusion. But another part of me recognized that I'd already achieved everything I'd set out to accomplish. My freedom was secure, my assets were protected, and I'd built a new life that didn't depend on my children's approval or affection. "I don't think I need to be there," I told Elena. "I've given my testimony, provided my evidence, and answered every question the prosecutors had. Christopher's trial is about his choices and their consequences, not about me anymore. Instead of attending the trial, I spent that week working in my garden, preparing for spring planting, and tending to the orchids that had thrived under my care throughout the previous year's turmoil. The hummingbirds had returned to their summer routine, and I'd added 2 more feeders to accommodate their growing population. Elena called me the day the verdict was announced. Christopher had been found guilty on all counts and sentenced to 3 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 18 months if he successfully completed treatment for gambling addiction. The judge had been particularly harsh in her sentencing remarks, noting that Christopher had shown no remorse for his actions and had continued to blame others even after his conviction. "How do you feel about the outcome?" Elena asked. "I feel like justice was served," I replied. "Not because I wanted Christopher to go to prison, but because his actions needed to have consequences. Maybe prison will finally force him to confront the choices that led him to this point." That evening, I sat on my back patio with a glass of wine and reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. A year ago, I'd been living in fear, documenting my children's conspiracy, and preparing for a battle I'd never imagined having to fight. Now I was secure in my own home, engaged in meaningful work helping other families, and building relationships based on respect rather than manipulation. The transformation hadn't been easy. There were still nights when I felt the weight of losing the family I'd thought I had, still moments when I wondered if I could have handled things differently. But those feelings were balanced by a deep sense of satisfaction in having stood up for myself and prevented a terrible injustice. My relationship with Marcus and Veronica remained complicated and distant, but it wasn't entirely severed. They sent cards on my birthday and holidays, brief but respectful acknowledgments of the connection we still shared despite everything that had happened. I didn't respond to these gestures, but I didn't throw them away either. They served as reminders that people could change, even if that change came too late to repair the damage they'd caused. 6 months later, I received an unexpected call from Christopher. He was calling from prison, and his voice carried a quality I'd never heard before, humility mixed with genuine regret. "Mom, I know you probably don't want to talk to me, and I understand if you hang up, but I needed to tell you that I'm sorry. Not because I want something from you, not because I think it will change anything, but because I finally understand what I did to you." I listened without responding as he continued. "The counselor here has been helping me understand that my gambling addiction was just part of the problem. The bigger issue was that I'd learned to see other people as resources instead of human beings. I saw your money as the solution to my problems without thinking about what that meant for your life and your freedom." He paused, and I could hear the institutional sounds of prison life in the background, doors slamming, voices echoing in concrete corridors. "I know I can't undo what I did, and I know you probably can't forgive me. But I wanted you to know that I'm getting help, and I'm trying to become someone who would never do something like this again." When he finished speaking, I found myself thinking about the little boy who'd cried when his pet hamster died, who'd brought me dandelions picked from the neighbor's yard, who'd hugged me fierce and tight after nightmares. That child and this man were the same person, separated by decades of choices that had led him further and further away from the values I'd tried to teach him. "Christopher," I said finally, "I'm glad you're getting help. I hope you're able to build a better life when you get out of prison. But I need you to understand that your apology doesn't change what happened between us. You tried to steal my freedom, and that's not something I can forget." "I know," he said quietly. "I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry, and that I understand now why what we did was so wrong." After the call ended, I sat in my study thinking about redemption and second chances. Christopher sounded genuinely different, more self-aware and accountable than I'd ever heard him, but I also knew that people could sound sincere while still being fundamentally untrustworthy, and that my willingness to help other families protect themselves from financial exploitation didn't extend to making myself vulnerable to further betrayal by my own children. 2 years after the confrontation that had changed everything, I hosted my first annual dinner for families who'd successfully prevented or overcome elder financial abuse. 15 people gathered in my dining room, sharing stories of survival and strength that would have been unimaginable to me during the months when I'd been focused simply on protecting myself from my children's conspiracy. Eleanor Walsh was there with her son and daughter-in-law, who'd undergone family counseling and were now genuinely supportive of her independence. Margaret Torres brought her attorney, who'd helped her recover assets that her nephew had stolen through forged documents. James Patterson attended with his daughter, who'd initially resisted his decision to disinherit her siblings, but had come to understand that their financial manipulation had made that choice necessary. As I looked around the table at these survivors and their allies, I realized that my children's betrayal had led me to something I'd never expected: a community of people who understood both the pain of family exploitation and the strength required to fight back against it. The dinner became an annual tradition, growing larger each year as word spread about the support network we'd built. We shared resources, legal referrals, and most importantly, the knowledge that surviving financial abuse by family members was possible with the right preparation and support. 5 years after the court hearing that had secured my freedom, I was contacted by a documentary filmmaker who was producing a series about elder rights and family financial crimes. She'd heard about my case through the nonprofit I'd helped establish, and she wanted to interview me about my experience. "Mrs. Nelson, your case has become something of a landmark in the elder advocacy community. You didn't just protect yourself, you created a model for how other families can prevent and respond to these situations." I agreed to participate in the documentary, not for personal recognition, but because I'd learned that sharing these stories could prevent other families from experiencing similar betrayals. During the filming, I spoke about the importance of trusting your instincts, documenting concerning behavior, and seeking legal help before situations reached crisis points. "The most important thing people need to understand," I said during one interview segment, "is that financial exploitation by family members is a crime, not a family dispute. When someone tries to steal your assets or strip you of your legal rights, you have the right to defend yourself, using every resource available." The documentary aired 2 years later and generated significant media attention. I received hundreds of letters from elderly viewers who'd recognized similar patterns in their own families, and many of them were able to take preventative action based on the strategies I'd described. On my 85th birthday, I received a card from Marcus that included a longer note than his usual brief acknowledgments. He'd been attending counseling regularly, had rebuilt his business on more sustainable principles, and had been sober from cocaine for 3 years. The note didn't ask for anything: no requests for reconciliation, no appeals for forgiveness. It simply provided an update on his life and expressed gratitude that I'd survived his betrayal with my dignity intact. "I know I forfeited the right to call you Mom when I participated in that conspiracy," he wrote. "But I want you to know that I think about the lessons you tried to teach me about integrity and respect, and I'm trying to live by those values now, even though it's too late to repair the damage I caused." Veronica had moved to Portland after her divorce from Brad, who'd been disbarred for his embezzlement activities. She worked as a victim advocate for a domestic violence organization, and according to Patricia, she'd found purpose in helping other women escape abusive situations. Her Christmas cards included photos of her volunteer work and brief updates about her efforts to build a life focused on service rather than self-interest. Christopher had been released from prison after serving 2 years, and he'd moved to a halfway house in Spokane, where he worked as a counselor for people struggling with gambling addiction. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd remained sober and debt-free since his release, and that he'd never attempted to contact me directly or indirectly. Each of my children had found ways to rebuild their lives after facing consequences for their actions, and I was genuinely glad they'd been able to create something positive from the wreckage of their conspiracy. But their growth and recovery didn't change the fundamental reality that they'd been willing to destroy my life for money, and that knowledge created a permanent barrier between us that no amount of rehabilitation could eliminate. As I entered my 10th decade, I remained in my own home, surrounded by the garden I'd cultivated, the friends I'd chosen, and the meaningful work I'd built from the ashes of family betrayal. My children had tried to steal my future, but instead they'd given me something unexpected: the knowledge that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable other people's destructive choices. The hummingbirds still visited my feeders each summer, their territorial disputes long since settled into a cooperative routine. They reminded me daily that even the smallest creatures could defend what was theirs when necessary, and that survival often required fighting battles you never expected to face. My story had become part of a larger movement to protect elderly people from financial exploitation, And I took pride in knowing that my refusal to be victimized had helped other families avoid similar betrayals. But the most important outcome wasn't the legal precedents or the advocacy work. It was the simple fact that I'd remained free to live my life on my own terms, in my own home, surrounded by people who valued me for who I was, rather than what I could give them. In the end, my children had taught me the most valuable lesson of my later years: that love without respect is manipulation, that family relationships require mutual dignity to survive, and that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is refuse to sacrifice your freedom for someone else's comfort. I'd given them life, raised them with every advantage, and loved them unconditionally for decades. When they'd chosen money over family, I'd chosen self-respect over enabling their betrayal. It wasn't the ending any of us had planned, but it was the ending their choices had made inevitable. And in the quiet dignity of my independent old age, surrounded by the beauty I'd created and the community I'd built, I was finally, completely at peace with that choice. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.